You know why I am against jihadists and communists and all of these things? The reason that I'm against it is because I'm from the Middle East. And guess what? This is what it means to care about Middle Eastern people. Why should there be this worldview that, oh, but you're all just oppressed people, so you should remain oppressed to remain true to your culture? That's not my culture. Nobody's culture is death. Nobody's culture is starvation. Nobody's culture is murder. Okay, this idea that this is a culture, this is a system that works for human beings, and if we deserve it, they deserve it too.
Challenge your ideas. It could be considered off limits.
Elica Le Bon, which sounds like, you sound like an international assassin.
I might be.
I was going to say.
I might be.
Well, can you tell us a little bit? I came across you just listening to your, your Instagram and how you were pretty unapologetic about where you stand, and there's no confusion with you. And I'm sure in a lot of ways you feel like you're sort of fighting this thing single-handedly.
Yeah.
So can you tell us your background, what you do? You're a lawyer?
Yes. I'm a lawyer. So I was born in London. My parents are from Iran. So they left after the revolution, or I guess my dad left just before. He was studying in the UK at Oxford, doing his PhD. And my mum and her family left after the revolution, after things got, crazy, bloody. Right. They were in prison and everything. My family were executed. And
really?
Yes.
And were they Jewish?
No.
They were not. Are you Shia?
Yes.
You are?
Yes, we
I
are.
thought you were Jewish for sure.
No, I know everyone thinks that.
And you are a Shia?
I'm not practicing.
No, but I'm saying,
yes.
but your family is Shia
yes,
Muslim.
Historically we come from Shia Muslim family. Yes.
I am amazed. I thought for sure you were.
I know.
Okay, so this is very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
People are like, wait, we thought only Jews understood the Jewish experience. And it's like, no, because we've seen what the Middle East does on the other end of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you might know the story of experiencing that, but there are also people who know the story of witnessing that happening.
It's going on right now in Syria, with the Alawites and the people loyal to Assad, the people who are part of the new government, the Christian minorities and things like that. The Middle East, as somebody who's lived there, didn't need Israel to be at war all the time. The Shia-Sunni divide is very, very significant, right? And it's always been
Israel
tribal.
is a pretext, by the way. Israel is a pretext for the expansion of jihadist regimes that have no other means to justify their violence other than saying that they're responding to Western imperialism in the form of Israel, right?
Right.
It's a pretext.
Yeah. So how did you start? What was the motivation to kind of start taking to Instagram? And so, what kind of a lawyer are you? You got your law degree.
Now I'm not practicing. I recently stopped practicing. I was actually doing criminal defense first.
Wow.
Which was so much fun.
Where?
In Orange County. So it was great because I was in court every single day and I learned a lot. I mean, you learn a lot, especially about extemporaneous speaking when you're in front of a judge that's shouting at you based on anything that you say. So you have to always know your facts. You have to know the law. You have to know the sources. You cannot step into a courtroom and not know what you're talking about, especially when somebody's life depends on it.
You're an effective debater.
Oh, yeah.
Watching you on Piers Morgan, I mean, you're so clear. You're so clear in how you speak, but more importantly, where you stand.
Because that's the training that I have, right? But the clarity is a different issue, which we'll get to. But so I was practicing, and then so after 2022, there was this revolution that sparked up in Iran. I don't know if you remember the girl Mahsa Amini. She was killed for showing some of her hair, not covering with her hijab. And I started speaking about Iran at that time. So that was about 3 years ago. And I noticed, it was good in the sense that people understood. Back then, they understood, okay, this is a terrorist regime. And then what happened is October 7th happened. And I remember vividly just anticipating that I was only just going to have to say a couple of words. I was just going to be like, so guys, terrorists, as we've discussed, moving on. And then people were like, oh, no, these guys are the freedom fighters. And I was like, oh no. And then I thought, okay, give it a couple of weeks. They just don't know anything about this. and that they were going to figure it out, and they didn't. So then it became a long-term investment for me to try and basically debunk this theory that jihadists are resistance or freedom fighters in any way.
This episode is sponsored by Aura. Guys, you ever wonder how scammers get your phone number or why your inbox is flooded with all kinds of spam? Well, there are companies out there called data brokers, and they sell your data against your, well, without your consent. You don't know it. They sell it to the highest bidder. They sell it to marketers. They sell it even to stalkers. And while they're legally required to remove your info if you ask, they make the process very confusing, very convoluted, all right? But guess what? Aura is a company that takes care of all the hard part by automatically removing your info from all of these sites, and they keep it off, all right? So it is, and I have a number of friends that have used this stuff. It is an excellent company. If you look at their reviews, they are crushing it. It's an all-in-one digital security company. You may already have a digital security tool, but not having Aura is like locking the front door but leaving the back door open, okay? You get alerts if your personal info is found on the dark web. You get real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more. US-based support available around the clock if something goes wrong. My whole family, I'm getting my whole family on this, okay? Because if anything does happen, Aura includes $5 million in identity theft insurance protection. How about that? One app, every layer of protection. That's why this podcast chooses Aura. Try Aura free 14 days at aura.com/Bryan Callen. Aura.com/Bryan Callen. In those 2 weeks, you'll discover where your data is being exposed and sold. All right. So I'm getting everybody I know on Aura in my immediate circle because it's just too important not to do. Thank you. Aura.com/Bryan Callen. You know, this is what, so I, as somebody who lived in the Middle East for a long time, you know, I've always been very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, the Arabs of the Levant, you know, who were under Ottoman. So you got to go back. And the problem with most people is they are coming into this debate in the 11th hour. And what they're seeing is horrible things in Gaza. The fact that the Israelis came in and essentially wiped out, you know, all of northern Gaza. This has been terrible for the Jewish diaspora. It's been terrible, I think, for Israel. And I think you're excused as a human being for looking at all those children and families. I think it's 1,000 extended families completely wiped out and saying, this cannot stand. I am standing with the Palestinian people who are people. Correct. And then there's the gangster organization called Hamas that is supported by Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran. And that's a whole different subject and a whole different conversation. And what you'll get a lot of times is people saying, well, you know, it is in Hamas and Hezbollah's interest to have as many dead Palestinian children as possible. And it is. It's a brutal way of, it's a brutal PR
strategy.
Campaign. Yeah.
Exactly.
But what I try to always look at is the history here. And if you put me in a time machine, as somebody who's very sympathetic to the Arabs and grew up around them and has nothing but positive experiences, they were under Ottoman rule. They were under British rule. They were under French rule. And then you've got to take in the massive amounts of anti-Semitism in Russia, Germany, Poland, and of course World War II.
Even in the Middle East, you know.
Of course. And then World War II. So the Jews were given, you know, of Europe were given nowhere to go after the Holocaust, after that decimation. And so they were going to stop at nothing.
From the Middle East, right?
Exactly.
950,000 of them expelled out of the Middle East.
Exactly.
Expelled out of Europe. Yeah. Nowhere else.
When I lived in Saudi Arabia, Jews were not allowed they were not allowed in Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
I remember that very well.
Wow.
When I lived there, and people should know this, and it's very recent that the House of Saud, the House of Islam, allows Jews, because they were expelled, because the Jews were always protected by the Muslim community, even in Iran.
As dhimmis.
They were, right, but they were people of the book and stuff like that. But when I lived in Saudi Arabia, there were no Jews in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. None, and they weren't allowed in.
And I think that's really an important thing for people to understand, that based on their expulsion out of the Middle East, because, just to clarify what a dhimmi is, if people don't know, it's essentially a second-class citizen. So yes, they do enjoy protection as being people of the book, but that protection is conditional on meeting certain conditions, such as paying these taxes, such as they weren't allowed to have property, such as they weren't allowed to ride horses, etc. And that includes Persians, Zoroastrians, Christians. They were all dhimmis as well. Yeah. But based on after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, if we were going to apportion the land, and just to be clear, if people don't know what the Ottoman Empire was, it basically, essentially, it was it was a caliphate. It was a caliphate that spread across the Middle East and North Africa, that had the caliph as one ruler, essentially. So these were individual provinces. They weren't countries with sovereign borders, right? So then at the collapse of the caliphate, when we went into the state building process, which was essentially most of the 20th century, the land that should have been apportioned to the Jews based on their population should be 7 times larger than Israel, right?
Right.
So they actually had to sacrifice what should have been apportioned to them, right? Whereas everybody else in the Middle East got the land that they wanted.
Right.
And so it's just interesting that even this tiny amount of land, right, that's still significantly smaller than what should have been apportioned to them, it makes people so angry that they even have the right to be there. Right. So in other words, what they're saying is that you just shouldn't exist, right? You should be, gassed out of Europe, chased out of Middle East, have no land anywhere, and basically just die.
Or there's a lot of people who I know who are new to this debate.
They say Uganda.
Well, that was, believe it or not, the early Zionists, that's right, who were thinking about actually settling Uganda as the promised land, which is crazy.
But that's not a problem for Ugandans
How
either.
interesting that
I know.
I remember that. That was always
it's one of the funny things that people say, why couldn't they go to Uganda? It's like, okay, why don't you go to Uganda?
Why don't you go to Uganda?
Yeah, why don't you go to Uganda?
I got no idea how to navigate Uganda. Don't swim in the water because there were crocodiles everywhere. I mean, all right, Uganda. But by the way, it might have been easier in some ways. But
not being around anti-Semites probably would have been easier.
But this is the first time in my lifetime where anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, voicing your sort of anti-Israel sentiments, is gone mainstream. You hear it all the time, and that's an interesting thing to me, because. You'll hear a lot of Americans say, and people I know will say, well, who says they have to have a homeland? How about the United States? They've been here for a long time. They're protected here.
How's that going?
Right. And I think that's right. I think if you're Jewish, all you have to do is go on. These guys were streaming the UFC when I was doing stand-up in Illinois. And I came back and all these guys who worked in the club were streaming the UFC because the ESPN app went down. So they illegally streamed it. And they were like, they had to turn off the comments because you could see the comments because he's like, bro, the comments are literally things like kill all the Jews, etc. It was a ticker tape parade of anti-Semitism.
It's terrifying.
And these guys were just kids from Ohio who were like, bro, we had to shut it out. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And it became a sideshow to the fights. And so I think if you were Jewish and you had the experience of the pogroms of your entire history and, of course, the Holocaust, if you don't have a homeland, what happens? I'll tell you what happens. It's not a homeland. If you don't have a nation state, because if you have a homeland,
correct,
then you're Tibet, then you're Chechnya, then you're all these other countries that, this is terrible. Look what you're doing to the Kurds. Well, all that happens is the UN goes, we condemn this, and you get gassed.
Useless.
It's useless.
Yes,
if you're a nation state, now you have the protection of the world who comes to your defense. You have alliances and stuff like that. So that was very important.
Well, or even protection from the nation itself, right? And it's funny you should mention that because that was always the explanation for why Jews were subjected to genocide and persecution everywhere they went, was that they didn't have a nation to protect them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's exactly
there was
right.
No, so of course,
the United States became the only place that they could
but it's not the same.
I know.
Right? Because look at the way things are now. The only protection I think they realized over time was just a Jewish majority state. Right? And that's so sad. Like how many thousands of years you tried to be around others and they didn't accept you. So you really have no choice but to create your own state. It's not for lack of trying, right? And I think I just, all of this goes back to this rise in anti-Semitism kind of leads into my theory about October 7th in the first place, which is that, I don't think that Hamas believed that it was going to defeat Israel on October 7th. Clearly it didn't, right? And this is a well-strategized plan. And as you mentioned, they are backed by the regime in Iran. And this was a 10-year-long operation. So incidentally, and let's not get too into things, but incidentally, about 10 years ago was the JCPOA, where Obama gave $150 billion in frozen assets to the regime.
Was that 10 years ago?
2015.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which Iranians
because then the idea was, you guys will
fund their
abandon your
proxies.
nuclear program. You'll be more reasonable.
Well, yes, that was sort of the plan containing the nuclear program, except that the agreement had sunset provisions, which would only last 10 to 15 years anyway, and then they could continue to enrich.
Right.
And then they would be $150 billion richer. So it was very much a kicking the can down the road issue. But anyway, we obviously knew that this regime is then going to continue to fund and train its proxies, namely Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. So what's interesting to me is that it's very clear Hamas didn't think it was going to defeat Israel on October 7th. But what it did was capture a couple of hundred hostages that would make it so that Israel had to go into Gaza, right? There's no other option.
Right.
And then Hamas buries itself every single place that would be the worst place to strike, right? Not necessarily around schools, okay? Yeah. Around schools, in hospitals, children's bedrooms, inside toys. So it gets to the point where Hamas is directing, right?
The strikes.
Directing the strikes, and then the strikes happen, and the entire world says Israel's the worst place in the world, Jews are the worst people in the world. And so that is the success of October 7th.
It's a huge success.
It's the PR war that makes everybody, and then what happens is that Israel's turned into a pariah state, right? It's an enemy of the international community, and that's how Hamas wins.
That's right. That's exactly right. I have to say, there's a grudging admiration for the way they've been able to turn the entire world against Israel, including for the first time half of the United States.
It's crazy. But it's so weird because you just anything they say, right? They'll show you a picture of Gaza and they'll be like, how can you excuse this? It's not excusing it. It's knowing what the cause is, which is Hamas. How do you not see that Hamas has buried itself here where the strikes are? You don't think this is Hamas's fault? How do you not have that moral clarity?
Well, I think people thought that the reaction, the idea that it's always been Israel's policy to make the price of Jewish blood very, very expensive. Because if you don't basically say, if you think there's any profit in doing this to us, if you think there's any profit, Hezbollah, in invading the north, Hamas invading the south, we're going to show you that you're going to pay for it with your own lives and your very network. And if you don't have that real politique, if you don't have that vicious sort of, line in the stand, you're going to get, it's going to be a bad day. And so in many ways, I think that for someone like Yair Gallant or whatever his name is, and Netanyahu, all those guys in the war room, these old, I always say, if I was Palestinian, I would probably hate Israel. If I was Israeli, I would probably be backing the regime because it's the only way I would feel I could survive.
Of course.
As a man, if I got my family there, there's a great saying about Israel. People had to forego who they could be for who they have to be. And sometimes you are in a part of the world where you have to embrace the angels of your darker nature or more practical nature or physics. Sheer physics is the only law of the land, and that's a tough one.
I think the one of the major problems that we're facing is that, and I mean, I'm starting to realize how much of a problem this is and how much a problem it has been, is that people just believe propaganda, right? So it's like anything that Hamas comes out and says, or, any jihadist group comes out and says, people believe it, right? So, one example of that is when people talk about Osama bin Laden's letter to America. And I'm like, but you understand that that's propaganda, right? And they're like, yeah, but it's true. I'm like, okay, sure, it's true. But do you understand that Osama bin Laden was a terrorist who was harming the people he claimed to be acting on behalf of. So he would say in his letter, oh, this is what you did to Yemenis. He was exploding Yemenis. Right? Do you not understand what propaganda is? Propaganda is something that might be true, but it's taken out of context or framed in a certain way in order to achieve a political objective. So when you're talking about what the jihadists said or what the terrorists said, and you're believing that, right? And then you're fact checking, you're like, yeah, well, I guess America was in Yemen at this point, and so maybe he has a point. But you don't understand that he has no point because he is the terrorist, right? And he's using these points to justify his actions. And so I think the problem with, especially in the Middle East, is that people don't understand that there is this long history of anti-Semitism, and there are a faction subset of people in the Middle East who will literally die just to kill Jews. They will sacrifice their lives, their children's lives, and they're so radicalized that they make it their life's mission. But people will just believe when they come out and say, oh, this is just about the occupation. People are like, I think that's what this is about, because they don't understand that there's more to it. And this is, what they're going to tell you.
Yeah. But I do think it's important to tackle and to give credence to the idea that when you create desperation, when you create a place like Gaza, which has been essentially under a blockade, in a lot of ways, and everything is controlled by Israel.
But because of Hamas, right?
Of course, but at the same time, the one it's very difficult. I'm always quiet. My buddy's Afghani Muslim, and he said, I don't know what to say. I said, you might want to say something like, sometimes I find myself shaking my head and saying a prayer, because I don't know. I when I study the history of what happened to the Arabs in the Levant, I'm very sympathetic to how horribly they were treated by the British, how horribly they were treated by the Ottomans, the Syrians with the French. It was not a good time. And so they never had a chance. A lot of them were subsistence farmers. A lot of them were Bedouin. And along comes these very modernized intellectual Jews who had deep ties to Britain and were very effective at using British influence and power in helping them establish the state.
Well,
and then, of course, turned on the
right?
well, they did. Then they actually kicked the British out.
Yeah, well, the Brits also sided with the Arabs in many ways
They
as well,
did.
and really significantly limited Jewish immigration to the extent
right.
that they were being sent back to the gas chambers.
That's right.
Right?
That's exactly right. But then, you had David Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, who were friends with Disraeli, and they also owned the Guardian. When I say they, I mean Jews that were sympathetic to the Zionist cause. So it was a very tough thing for the Arabs who were not sophisticated back then.
Yes.
And that's all I'm saying is that, so people who are pro-Palestinian, a lot of people who are not pro-Hamas, but you can be sympathetic.
Yeah, just to touch on that, I think what the failure was at that time was the radicalized leadership that was making decisions on behalf of Palestinians, which ended up harming them. Like a classic example is when you had one of the offers for statehood, for Palestinian statehood, was 1939, I think it was the White Papers. Yeah. And the offer was that it was going to be a Palestinian state, an Arab Muslim Palestinian state. And there was going to be 10,000 Jews that were permitted to come to Palestine each year during this immigration crisis.
I think it was 75,000.
75,000 total.
Right, okay.
It was 10,000 each year and then 75,000 total. And there would be no partition of the land. And then Arabs would have the discretion of whether to allow Jews after that. Now, moderate Arab leadership wanted to accept that offer, right? I mean, first of all, Israel didn't accept it, so it doesn't matter. Moderate Arab leadership wanted to accept that offer, but then you had the radicalized leadership, like the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was meeting with Hitler, that was just essentially like, no Jews on this land because we want to end Jews. And so it was that bloodlust for ending Jews entirely that led to the compromise of a Palestinian state. So it's always anti-Semitism that's interrupting or frustrating the process of Palestinian statehood. And people don't understand that history, Had that anti-Semitism not been a thing, they would have accepted a state at that point. And this whole thing would have been, redundant.
That point can be argued But this is what happens with this debate is you have scholars that would push back on that, and then you'd have your scholars who push back on that. And my thing about this, this conflict is, it depending on where you're standing and what you've read and what you think, and you can be Jewish, you can be Shia Muslim like you. I mean, you come from that tradition or whatever, and everybody's going to have a different point of view. And sometimes I just think that, and so it goes. Like, we're having this talk, and it's like nothing is going to get solved. Somebody said the only person who can solve this is God. If you read the Old Testament, Gaza's mentioned probably, I don't know, I just read it again. It's mentioned probably 13 times at least, as a place you don't want to be, because it didn't have a lot of water, and it was, kind of a sun-baked part of the world. So I don't know, man. I find myself, but what I appreciate about what you do is you are there to kind of say, hold on, there is a right and a wrong. There is a way to do things. And we have to do that. You cannot be sort of like general about this, because if you don't do that, the world will sort its way out anyway.
And that's kind of what's happening.
It is.
And I think this is kind of really the main point, is that it's not about the facts anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Because we can all agree about the facts. It's the issue is the moral clarity. That's the thing that people don't have. So
but how do you reconcile the massive amount of murder, or I don't know how many families and civilians in Gaza were killed, but does Israel play any part in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it plays as much part as any country or any nation where it's, I mean, how else do you respond? What's the other alternative? And that's the thing. Like, when people say, oh, I'm just anti-war, who isn't anti-war? Right? Who's a person that says, I love to watch children being killed?
Until they come in and take your children and your wife as prisoners.
But the what it goes back to constantly, time and time again, is that who's putting you in this position, right? Who's putting you in this position? Yeah. And that's where the moral clarity is identifying the cause of the upset, identifying the cause of the harm that's being done. Yes. And so that doesn't mean that there's no responsibility on the response, right? Because even within, you have parameters within which, correct response, whatever's considered a correct response. And then, of course, you can do things that are outside of those parameters, but you still have the but-for cause, right? Which is but for October 7th, there would not be a single Gazan child that was killed, right? And so we have to, the moral clarity is understanding that this terrorist regime is making Gazans vulnerable to the aftermath, right? And it's also a regime that conveniently protects itself. It goes and hides underground and has no Iron Dome, no investment in protecting its people. Why? Because, as we said, they want to maximize civilian casualties. And so I think just looking at it from outside and just being like, well, these are the facts. We all have the facts, but it's about the moral clarity. It's something that I really struggle with, especially when you get people who are thinkers, even authors like Norman Finkelstein, for example, who said that, the Houthis deserve a Nobel Peace Prize. And this is somebody who's a scholar of the conflict.
He's always been.
But what I'm saying is that it's that inability to discern. Like, even in the situation now that we're dealing with Russia and Ukraine, for example, right?
Before we go to that,
okay,
I want to just piggyback on what you're saying.
Okay.
The way I think of it is this. Amos Oz, who was the Israeli writer, 20 years ago, I remember him saying, Hamas is an idea, and it's a bad idea. And the way you beat a bad idea is with a better idea. Mm-hmm. And I think my message to Israel would be that you're never going to kill Hamas. Mm-hmm. You can't kill an idea like this with bombs and missiles. Mm-hmm. There is something called total eradication of the enemy. If you want to do what the Allies did to the Nazis or to the Japanese Empire, you can. You can bomb them to the point where, look up what we did to Dresden and Berlin and places like that. Parts of Dresden were hotter than the sun. We dropped these incendiary bombs, and the idea was really to kill the German worker. It just is. I mean, Curtis LeMay himself said, I would probably be tried as a war criminal. If you want to go with total destruction, then you go ahead and do that. But I think and I hope that in many ways, as the world is watching, you can't get away with that. But there are men that will do that, because there is a philosophy that says the only way I'm going to get rid of this is to literally wipe people out. The other idea is there something that Israel can do to give the Palestinians something to lose, a future to look forward to? Their children have a better future than I do. When you can do that with people, if their kids have no future, if they're never going to go anywhere, because I went to the West Bank and I saw that wall, and I saw and I spoke to Palestinians. Their kids, if they do get a work permit and they get to come into Israel, they're going to wait in a long line, and you might get to work in a fast food place at a truck stop. As long as that is the case, I don't think that Israel will ever have peace, and I don't think the Palestinians will either. And I think that's significant. So my only solution, which isn't a solution, is the Israelis have got to give the Palestinians something.
So I think on the other side of that, right? You talk about, what is the reason for this divide? And as we have even seen in this past year, that there have been terrorists that broke out of the West Bank and massacred Israelis. Sure. And so those Palestinians that you're talking about, the women and children who just want to live their lives, are being put in that position because of the terrorists. And so it always goes back to the cause that we cannot ignore. And I think as much as we talk about these things, because we can analyze this from a humanitarian perspective, and that humanitarian perspective says we just want Israelis and Palestinians to coexist and live together and be fine, which of course that's our perspective, right? But then on the other side, what is the practicality of it? What is the practical solution to the fact that you can't stop people from trying to kill Israelis? And that's the thing that's hindering the life of the Palestinian child and mother, right? So what do you do? What's the solution?
Well, who is the bad guy in this? Like, to what degree, as someone who's Shia, comes from that tradition, I know, but I like to keep saying that because people think you're Jewish.
Because I'm not religious.
Yeah. But to what degree do you lay the blame on the actual religion itself versus just the geography?
I think it's so the way that it's best understood is that it's not necessarily the religion itself, but the extremism of it. Yeah. Right? Exactly. And that has existed historically in other religions too. Christianity, we've seen the history of its extremism, but that's been tempered now, at least reasonably. So what we're witnessing is the result of that sort of extremism. And it isn't just Islamism, right, which is Islamic extremism. There's also other forms of extremism that have come in nationalism, right? So there has been like Arab nationalism, for example, that has taken that view of river to the sea, and there's no other exception. Right. All of these sort of extremist worldviews where it's like we just cannot tolerate you existing at all is what is frustrating any form of coexistence. And so when people look at this situation and they're like, look at how dire the situation is for Palestinians, and it's like, we all agree, right? We all agree. Yeah. We just don't agree on what's causing that. Right. So it's very easy to say, well, clearly it's Israel that's causing that by creating this divide. And then you ask, but what's the reason for the divide? And what's the solution? Yeah. What do we do instead of this divide?
What do we do?
I mean, I talk about de-radicalization all the time, but I don't know how you can force people to become de-radicalized. I don't know. What does Israel go?
You got to give them something I think you've got to give them something to lose. In other words, you've got to give people.
Well, that's what Trump did.
Yeah, you've got to give them. What do you mean?
So I don't think that Trump intends to take over Gaza.
I don't either.
I think what he did was, I mean, he's a businessman.
You could have a beautiful future. That's what he said.
I think what he was doing is trying to get the Arab leadership in the region to step up and say anything but America in the Levant.
Which I think he is doing.
And I think that's what's happening.
What happened. Yeah.
I think the Arab leadership is now like, let's make a plan for Gaza.
Right. Which is a $55 billion plan or something like that.
But that was always what we wanted them to do, is to take, so maybe that what you're talking about is that.
I think that when I saw that, I thought that was a brilliant move by Trump.
It was such a plan. It was such an obvious plan.
Underestimate that guy's intelligence.
Yeah, they do.
The time. You can say whatever you want about him. He's a narcissist, all that. But the man knows how to say something outrageous.
He's a good businessman.
He's a good businessman.
He's a very good businessman. He gets things done. Yeah. And so when people were, saying, "Oh, this is so outrageous, America's going to take over," I was like, "But it's not what he's saying. It's not going to happen." Yeah.
That's right. It might sound insensitive, but now you're right. The Arab leaders didn't want to be shamed. Yeah. And they said, we'll build this up. And you definitely want a gleaming city on the Mediterranean. That'd be nice for the Palestinians.
It was like a reversal of what happened. So what they wanted was no Israel, right? And so what they were getting was double Israel.
Yeah.
Because America to them is the same as Israel.
Right.
So instead of, it's flipped the strategy of Israel attacking its enemies to instead doubling Israel by making it Israel and America. Right. And for them, they were just like, okay,
no way.
Anything but that.
I don't think the Israelis ever wanted Gaza.
No, they don't.
They don't want to be there.
They don't.
It's they never liked it. But remember, 2005, they expelled, I think, 15,000 of them, or maybe even more.
Yeah.
So at a great expense. So I think that's a very interesting thing. I pray that there's a better future for the Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah.
I pray there's a better future for the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Yeah.
I really do. I think about it all the time.
No, and I feel so sorry for them. The fact that, there's always, even just if you look at their history of being expelled into different places and everywhere they go because of the terrorists that go with them, they have to be kicked out of these refugee camps. And it's so unfair.
Well, think about Iran, your own country of origin,
and that's why I
the potential
understand it.
for Iran.
Yes,
with their culture and their history and their emphasis on education and family. I mean, the hardliners have to be there or they die. Yeah. But 70% of that country, I think, is under 30 or something crazy.
Yeah.
So it's like, let's go.
90% of them are against the regime.
Of course.
And so it's that exactly that understanding that I have of Iran that I can apply to Gaza, that anything that, the regime causes suffering for our people, I understand that the regime is the root cause of that. And I understand what we could be if that wasn't in the way. Yeah. I think it's harder for Palestinians because those sort of factions are embedded within their society. So it's not like one regime that they can just reject and go on to have a prosperous life, right? It's totally embedded within the society. So
the children are taught from a very young age too.
Yeah.
It's the problem with indoctrination is that you now have a systemic hatred and a systemic radicalization.
Yeah, and it's reinforced by the evidence, right? Because look at Gaza. So if any of those kids were for a second to believe, maybe I'm being indoctrinated, they look at Gaza and they're like, oh no, this is clearly the enemy.
Your heroes are the people fighting Israel and dying.
Exactly. But it's not being shown to them necessarily that those heroes are the ones that are causing that.
I saw a young boy shaking hands with all these Hamas fighters.
Yeah.
And they were all kind of in their masks with their guns. And as a little boy, I can tell you, for me to look up at those guys who were fighting the, Goliath, would be very, very, I would never forget that. Those are my heroes, and that's what happens. That's kind of, talk to me about Ukraine, because you were also, this is another thing we're seeing with people saying, well, we're in a situation now where basically, Putin was put in a corner with Ukraine's flirtation with NATO membership. The United States knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And so now what you have is, it's a complicated situation because Russia rolled in all those tanks, killed a lot of civilians. Blah, blah, blah. So talk to me about that.
So this is kind of the point that I wanted to get into when we were talking about, academics and scholars of the conflict or any of these conflicts where there's no issue with the facts, right? So people always think that, if they just express the facts, they'll be like, but didn't you know that NATO expanded this much and this happened and this happened and this happened? I'm like, it's not the facts. We agree on the facts. It's the moral clarity, right? So, what I'll hear people say is they'll give examples and they'll be like, well, NATO or democracies going near Russia. Like, this is just imagine if communism came near democracies. And I'm like, that's not the same thing, okay? The facts might be the same, but that's not the same equivalent, right? You know why? Because that is a system that results in the massacre and of millions, of famine, of devastation, of destruction, of killing dissidents, right? So that coming near us, that's a huge problem.
I mean, communism is sacrificing the individual to the collective, and the state is your God. Let's be very clear.
Exactly. Yeah. So when they say, well, if communism came to Mexico, we'd have a problem with it. That's not the same as if democracies go near communism. And then the second thing, and people really don't realize how they're justifying this, even if, let's say, a communist regime set up its troops in Mexico, right? What we would hope that the US would do is go after those troops. But if the US started targeting Mexican children, intentionally targeting Mexican civilians, you're telling me that that's about communism.
Right.
Or is that about the fact that the US has an interest in controlling and usurping Mexico, right? That's a pretext. So the war against communism in that context would be a pretext for taking over Mexico. It's exactly the same thing. When Putin is attacking Ukraine, civilians, individuals, and people are like, oh, Putin's problem is NATO. Why isn't Putin going after NATO? Where are the attacks on NATO? So it's not about NATO, right? Right. Oh, Putin is put into a corner because democracies are coming near an authoritarian regime. That's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing.
That's not a bad thing.
And people forget that Yushchenko, who was democratically elected in Ukraine, was a pro-Western leader, because would you rather be closer to Europe and the United States or Russia, a one-crop economy with nuclear weapons? I mean, what does Russia have to offer that Europe, Western Europe and the United States, you'd rather be in that mix?
Well, the evidence speaks for itself.
Of course it does. And
all the Soviet bloc is in NATO.
Tried to kill Yushchenko. They poisoned him with dioxin. You can see the before and after pictures. Talk to the Georgians, talk to the Chechenis, talk to the Dagestanis, talk to all of the people who are under Russian domination. It is an expansionist empire. That's what I always say. Like, are you forgetting? Go talk to the Georgians about election meddling. Go talk to, the Chechenis. Go see what before and after Grozny, when they came in and literally, you want to talk about carpet bombing and turning it into the surface of the fucking moon. That's what Putin's regime did. So let's not kid ourselves here. It's unbelievable that people fall for this.
But it goes back to that sort of moral decay, and that moral decay that we're dealing with, which actually, the Soviet defectors described as demoralization, right, was a process that, it was such a significant effort that was put in by the Soviet Union. And this concept of demoralization, I think this is... What I think is the best way to explain things is to use an analogy, right? So this is an analogy that I think people will understand. Let's say you have a robber, okay, and he pulls up to a citizen, just an ordinary civilian, puts a gun to that civilian's head and takes their child or something, whatever, right? And then you have a cop who's at the scene, and the cop sees what's going on, puts a gun to the robber's head, right? Are the facts identical? Sure, the facts are identical. But wait, he's holding a gun to the robber's head and the robber's holding a gun to the civilian's head. So aren't these two guys just as bad as each other? Oh my God, no, they're not.
No.
Okay, first of all, no, they're not. But this is what happens, right? This is what demoralization is. You inundate a people with so much bad information about that cop, right? Turns out he's a wife beater. Turns out he maybe even killed his wife. Turns out he might be the worst guy in the world. But guess what? In this scenario, in this freeze frame, we still support the cop. And if you don't understand why, if you don't understand the difference, we are in trouble.
And that's where I appreciated how you speak, because you're very articulate in highlighting the meaningful difference between things. And that is so important. You see people who are not as informed drawing sort of these comparisons. What you have to do is learn how to draw the difference. That is where the truth lives.
The moral difference.
Yes.
It's called moral discernment.
It is called moral discernment. Here's where I will play devil's advocate and defend some people who are, for example, anti-war and don't trust the Ukraine situation. And this is, the United States has engaged in one conflict or another, especially in the destabilization and overthrowing of Iraq and the de-Baathification therein, and the fact that that was handled so poorly. And a lot of people can point to the neocons who are primarily right-wing kosher Jews. I'm just making this comparison, which they say this was about protecting Israel, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, all of the New American Enterprise Institute, which is mostly, Jewish. So you get these people who start to get worked up around this, and they say, look, this wasn't just about the United States. This was about fighting Israel's wars, right? So you get all that.
Well,
again, I don't go down that rabbit hole
because
that it is what it is.
Yeah.
But what I think people see with Ukraine and Russia is, here we go again. The United States trying to make the world a safer place, and we're going to get ourselves back in this quagmire. We never get ourselves a break. It costs a fortune. It's handled terribly. There's no accountability. On and on. 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what happened? Back to square one.
Yeah.
So you can understand how people lose their faith in institutions, starting with the Catholic Church, of course, and then you can say the FBI and all this stuff, the way they behave in the election, blah blah blah. But I sympathize with people who don't trust mainstream media after COVID. Who don't trust the pharmaceutical companies after COVID, who don't trust our foreign policy and our leaders because they don't feel represented, and they see what a mess they made of the Middle East. You could make an argument that because of our activities in Iraq and Afghanistan, that is what gave rise to the destabilization in Syria, which, by the way, was also meddled with by the CIA, and the destabilization of the Assad regime, but also ISIS, also, the insurrection and all that stuff. So
well,
how would you?
Yeah, first of all, I'm gonna call bullshit on all of that.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Not everything you said before, just the last part that you said. And the reason that I'm going to call bullshit on that is because in the 7th century, jihadists conquered 25% of the world, and they didn't do it with any provocation, and they didn't do it with any Western imperialism. They said the exact same thing that they say today. When they conquered the Sasanian Empire in Iran in the 7th century, they sent a message and they said, submit to us or we will send you a people that love death more than they love life. And they acted that way. Islam was spread by the sword. It was not provoked. And so what happened after the collapse of the last caliphate, which was in the early 20th century, was that there was a revivalist movement. I think one of the main architects or the ideological architects of that movement was Rashid Rida. And he inspired a lot of thinkers, like the thinker of the leader of Jamiat-e-Islami, I think even Osama bin Laden. A lot of these leaders of jihadist group were inspired by this thinking of reviving the caliphate after it collapsed. Saladin, being so these things, the idea, which is a very naive idea, is that if the West didn't go into the Middle East would be thriving. I'm sorry. The Middle East has not been thriving for the past 1400 years, and that has nothing to do with the West. Sure,
you're right that
it's
tribalism.
It's tribalism. Yeah. You're right that could have further destabilized. But then you have to think, what was the alternative? Okay, so you're saying that if we had just left Saddam Hussein to his own devices, who was murdering millions of Iranians, chemical genocide against the Kurds, okay,
started 2 wars with Iran.
And endless. You're saying Kuwait. That the alternative would have been peachy keen? Of course not. So yeah, I can agree with you that the America's meddling definitely may have upset something, but not something that wouldn't have been upset otherwise. So let's just be clear
Again, you have to
go
back to the Soviet Union, the ideological battle between communism and democracy, the Western sphere of influence, the Eastern sphere of influence, and all the people caught in the middle of that, proxy wars.
Iran is a perfect example of that, because the last Shah was Mohammad Reza Shah, and the Shah before him was Reza Shah. He was deposed because he would not allow a Persian corridor for the Allies to fight. Okay, and so that really caused a lot of problems for Iran down the road, okay, major problems, which maybe even led to its demise ultimately. But we also understand that was, in response to what was going on during World War II. So, right. But anyway, that all aside, what I wanted to say, which is more important than that, was that when you talked about the United States failures out in the world, I think this goes back to what we're talking about with the moral discernment, because you can morally discern between right and wrong, but still understand that this is a bad strategy, right? So you can say very easily, listen, I understand the difference between a democracy and an autocracy, okay? So the West versus Putin, but I just don't agree with the strategy that's being used here. So it's okay to have that opinion. It's okay to think that the United States has failed everywhere, but you have to understand the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, and that's the thing that people don't understand anymore, because they've been so demoralized.
Could not agree more.
That they think the bad guys are the good guys now.
I think there's a tendency for an intellectual and somebody who's not as informed to kind of say, who's to say? Or this is a complicated gray area.
That's the goal of demoralization. The goal of demoralization is not that you side with terrorists. If you side with terrorists, you're mentally ill.
It's to get people to give up.
It's to get you to say, well, these are all, I think the US are terrorists and jihadists are terrorists, so I'm just going to not support either. And when you don't support either, you support the jihadists. That's the goal of demoralization.
That's a really, really good point. And that is so true. And it's really hard sometimes to come down on, it's very difficult for me with the Israeli-Palestinian situation. My buddy said, you have a platform, you should start speaking up for the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. I said, listen, dude, this conflict has been going on since Moses had a parting of the ways with the Pharaoh. And whatever Bryan Callen, the comedian, jackass first before anything else is going to say.
It matters.
Well, I like having people like you on especially because I thought you were actually Persian Jewish and Israeli, and you're not.
No.
And that's very unique. And you've got a lot of guts, too, to be speaking the way you do. But it's clear that you have... first of all, you've seen your own country and you've seen sort of how many people's futures have been robbed under that regime. You're not romanticized by anything. You had your own family murdered.
Yeah.
And that puts you in a position where you say the difference between a good idea and a bad idea, the price of being morally ambivalent is that people die, including the people closest to you.
100%.
And that's where I really saw you. I didn't know any of this, but I just saw you so clear-eyed, so thoughtful, and so unambiguous. And it's very, very refreshing.
Thank you.
It really is.
But I think this is really the essence of it, is that, I really started to see that we're not in an age of lacking information. We might be in an age of having too much information. Correct. People don't know how to process that information. Right. And so they take that information and become demoralized. And this is exactly what I saw was lacking, was an ability to discern, that moral clarity, that moral discernment. And that's exactly what led to the fall of my country, right? Again, it wasn't that the facts were necessarily wrong. When, Iranians at that time were told about Western imperialism, maybe that wasn't wrong. Maybe that was true. But they didn't see at that time that was being wielded, right? That was being wielded to gain some type of advantage and ultimately foment the revolution that brought in the Islamic regime. Right. But it's that when society becomes demoralized in that way, where they take on all of this information and they can't do that calculus, right? Where they say, okay, I understand all of this bad information about this cop, okay, but I still understand that we have to support him against the robber, right? When a society loses its ability to do that, then we start supporting the robber. Right. And once we start supporting the robber, we start supporting the collapse of order in society. And that is exactly what disinformation was designed to do.
I think that's what BLM was doing.
Yeah.
To a large extent. You saw that. What is your plan? You are you're such an articulate, intelligent human being. What are you, and young.
Yeah.
What do you want to do? I'm getting Candace Owens vibes.
Okay. So it's so funny because people say that I'm the opposition to Candace Owens.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, Candace is somebody who's got this sort of very anti-Israeli sort of like bent now, and she was talking about it on Theo Vaughn, and I've got friends who are like, who are Jewish, who are like, dude, we're getting crushed here. But again, to your point, you can break down Israel's lobbying efforts and how they behave, but then that is within the larger context of what choice does one have when surrounded by a
entire world of hate.
I don't think anybody else would behave otherwise. They've been very good at figuring out a way to survive.
That is what it needs to be understood, right? Yeah. All of this is a method of survival. Yeah. And maybe the survival, isn't perfectly executed, but it's survival. Is it ever, right?
Right. So you're writing a book.
I'm writing a book. Yeah.
What's the book?
It's essentially about everything that I talk about. I talk about the root or the trajectory of these historic sort of leftist social justice movements, which I was sucked into, right? Yeah. I was the biggest leftist my whole life. And then slowly things started to unpack for me. And I think this is why I talk so much about what do I talk so much about? Deprogramming.
Yeah, deprogramming.
Deprogramming, because what I often explain to people is that people aren't going to see the light by hearing more facts and more information. They've heard all the facts. They've heard all the information. Right. So it's the deprogramming. So, just like the example that I gave about understanding the difference between good and bad, right or wrong, even when there's so much bad about the good guys. I think about, I'll go back to what I was saying, but I think about the times when, we used to have these movies, right? We used to have these movies where there would be the bad guys that wanted to kill everybody, right? And for the good guys to capture the bad guys, they would lie. Yeah. They would mislead. They would lure them and trap them and then kill them. And people would be like, that's wonderful that happened. Right. But now in a demoralized society, we're like, but the good guys lied.
You hear this all the time.
They're just as bad as the bad
the biggest
guys.
Terrorists in the world.
Yeah,
and all
it's
that
so
stuff.
stupid.
Yeah.
It's so stupid because the objective is completely different.
You need to debate Candace.
Pointless exercise.
It would be fun though, and I think that listen. I hate to tell you this. You should have your own show.
Mm-hmm. Working on that too.
Good, because I can't wait for that. You are going to debate Candace eventually. It's going to be great for your numbers, and you're going to have your acolytes. She has her acolytes, and you're going to make a fortune. Just so you know, you're going to make a fortune, and I'm serious. And what happens to every one of us trying to make a difference in the world is you're going to get sucked right into the whole biosphere, and you're going to have a big house, and you're going to make all this money, and you're going to write another book, and people are going to love you, and you're going to go out there, and people are going to be like, I don't like you, and you'll be like, whatever, and then you're like, I love you, and that's what's going to happen. You whether you like it or not, are going to purify your own echo chamber. You're going to have your own army. And look, it's your charisma, it's your intelligence, it's your look, it's your courage, it's your moral clarity, and
tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, you're a star in the making. I can see it, and I'm calling it here first for sure. That's why I was so excited that you wanted to do this podcast, because
thank you.
I am a guy who would never be like you, because I am hopelessly in the middle, and I want people to like me.
No, I think that's good. I think that's good.
I'm a comic. If my joke is if you want me to join your protest and you want me to make a sign, my sign is going to say something like "Ugh." Or it's complicated. but I respect that. No, but I also really appreciate the fact that there is a time in life where you can't make a left turn, you can't make a right turn. That we've got to decide on what's right or wrong.
Yeah.
And I actually, at the end of the day, do believe in good and evil. I do believe in right and wrong. Yeah. And I think to do otherwise is irresponsible, and frankly, you become part of the problem. 100%. And when I say part of the problem, you're part of what gets people killed. It's a bad idea.
And gets yourself killed in the end.
That's exactly right.
Can you imagine if we were anti-war during the Cold War? Can you imagine if we were like, look at what they're doing to the communists?
Good luck with that. Exactly. And
we would all be dead.
That's where I'm not morally ambiguous on by the people, for the people, of the people.
Yeah.
A refined democracy, a bicameral legislature, all these things, these checks and balances. A country that is a country of a rule of law, individual liberty.
That's what we stand for.
That's what we stand for.
And that's what we fight for.
Because that's truer. It's truer.
Because it works.
Yes.
It works for human beings.
Yes.
And that's why we fight for the survival of that. Not, and understanding that the terrorist regimes, the communist regimes, the autocratic regimes that are putting us in a position that we have to fight them, that's the problem.
Well, it also allows people to flourish and realize their full potential.
That's exactly what we fight for.
A woman with your brain was put in
Iran,
you would have to be...
I'd be dead.
You'd be dead, or you'd be...
in prison.
Or I'd have to beat you at least once a week, and you'd be in my house. Because what is that? That's a lie. That's a man saying, I don't want you to be smarter. I don't want you to speak this because it threatens my order. And it's a lie. And I don't think lies stand. I don't think lies can stand.
And this is exactly the problem with this postmodernist worldview of cultural relativism, where all cultures and all systems and all things are all the same. No, they're not. There are systems that work for human beings.
That's right.
Democracies work for human beings. That's where human beings thrive. And if you don't understand that, you probably haven't been into the other place.
That's how I feel. I grew up in these socialist utopias.
Right.
I grew up there. I saw real poverty.
Yes.
I was in Yemen. I saw what full-blown leprosy looks like with my own eyes. I was in Damascus. I saw the markets where I saw real leprosy in Damascus. I saw it in Yemen. I grew up, in Pakistan. My mother kept somebody alive, a woman on the street alive. I saw that. I've been to Africa. I've seen that real poverty.
Yeah.
So
and you know what? This is a perfect thing to wrap it up with. You know why I am against jihadists and communists and all of these things? The reason that I'm against it is because I'm from the Middle East. And guess what? This is what it means to care about Middle Eastern people. It means that all of those luxuries and privileges and individual rights that you enjoy, I want my people to have those things too. But there's something that's getting in the way of that. And that's the thing that we need to fight so that the people of the Middle East can enjoy all of the things that you enjoy. Why should they just be reserved for you? Why should there be this worldview that, but you're all just oppressed people, so you should remain oppressed to remain true to your culture? That's not my culture. No. Nobody's culture is death. Nobody's culture is starvation. Nobody's culture is murder. Okay, this idea that this is a culture, this is a system that works for human beings, and if we deserve it, they deserve it too.
It could be considered